Hello, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom, the field director for the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for our HoUSed national call, where we discuss some of the very important policy developments and efforts going on throughout the country to achieve housing that is universal, stable, and affordable for everyone. We have a great presentation for you available today and a really good lineup of presenters. And I would love to walk you through the agenda really quickly. We will start with a policy update from our very own Sarah Sadian here at NLIHC, giving you the fresh scoop of what's going on Capitol Hill. There have been a lot of developments over the last few days, many of which make us feel that there is some urgency for advocates like yourselves throughout the country. Then we're going to talk about a really exciting and really interesting new report on the impact of evictions on voter turnout. And this will be from Jillian Slee of Eviction Lab. After that, we're going to talk about impact of evictions on healthcare utilization. So sort of pivoting from elections to talking about healthcare. And we're happy to have with us Gabriel Schwartz from the University of California, San Francisco. And then we'll talk about a new report that NLIHC has done on tenant protections and emergency rental assistance during and beyond the pandemic. And we'll have Jade Vasquez from our Erase team share about that new report and the wonderful data and useful tools within it. Then we'll turn it over to take a look at what's happening throughout the country. And we'll hear field updates from Tara Borauskas of the Community Corporation of Santa Monica in Southern California, Katie West, Housing Network of Rhode Island, and Sue Schierick, who is with Northlands Rescue Mission in Grand Forks and leads the work of the North Dakota Coalition for Homeless People. I'd like to remind everyone that today's session will be recorded and that we share that recording along with notes of today's presentation in an email that will go out to all registrants tomorrow. If during the presentation today you have questions for any of our panelists, please drop those questions into the Q&A box. You'll see Q&A as an option at the bottom of your screen, or you can drop it into the chat box as well. We'll try to make sure all questions get answered, but because of time, we might not be able to get through 100%. So with that, let's get started. And as I mentioned, we will begin with Sarah Sadian. Sarah, please take it away.
Great. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to be with you today. I wanted to share with you the latest on the housing investments that are in the Build Back Better Act, which include many of the top priorities we all have been working on together. $25 billion to expand rental assistance, $65 billion to preserve public housing, and $15 billion to build new homes through the National Housing Trust Fund. But unfortunately, we think that those housing investments are in serious risk of being either eliminated or deeply cut from the Build Back Better Act as it moves forward. The reason why we think this is because last week, President Biden confirmed while speaking at a press event, his strategy for moving the Build Back Better Act forward, now that Senator Manchin stated that he was going to vote against the bill in its current shape. So the Biden strategy is to enact a much more scaled down version of the Build Back Better Act, just focusing on a few priorities, and everything else would be repackaged into smaller bills. But I want to be really clear with all of you, because I know that we've been working on this issue for the last year together and pushing for these resources. This approach is extremely dangerous for housing investments in the bill. And if housing is repackaged into a separate bill, it really means that those bills aren't going to go anywhere and we aren't going to see really historic investments in housing this year. The reason why I say that is because Democrats have just one opportunity to pass a budget reconciliation bill. So that's a process that we've talked about many times on this call before, but it allows Congress to pass a bill with just a simple majority in the Senate rather than requiring 60 votes. And so if Democrats are able to pass a streamlined or a scaled back version of the Build Back Better Act using budget reconciliation, that means that anything that doesn't make the cut or anything that's repackaged into a standalone bill would need to have the support of every single Democrat, plus at least 10 Republicans, and it would require separate floor time during a midterm election year. It virtually means that there is no chance that housing investments will be enacted this year if they are separated out from the Build Back Better Act. So That means that our advocacy is incredibly important now and for the next couple of weeks. If you can, I'd love to encourage you to continue to contact your members of Congress and urge them to protect the historic investments in affordable housing that are in the Build Back Better Act, and to make sure that those investments, especially like I said, rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund, to make sure that those are part of any budget reconciliation bill that advances and not separated off into a separate bill. I will say that we've done this before. If you remember last summer, we got word that housing investments could be cut entirely from the Build Back Better Act, or maybe cut to as little as $30 billion. But it's because of all of you guys making phone calls, putting pressure on the White House, putting pressure on your members of Congress, that we were able to get those resources back up to $154 billion in the House bill. So I know that this is something that you all can do, and I want to encourage you to be very vocal and vigilant and consistent the way that you always are, very effective in demanding that housing investments stay in the Build Back Better Act. So just two things. I wanted to mention one thing about timing, so you have a sense of how long this advocacy will continue. Right now, the House and Senate are on recess for this week, but they're going to take up negotiations on Build Back Better starting when they return. I think their hope is to get something finalized so that President Biden can mention it at the State of the Union, which is scheduled for March 1st. So I think that means for the next several weeks, we have a big fight on our hands to make sure that housing investments stay in the budget reconciliation bill. So there's two things that you can do that would be most effective. One is continue to contact your members of Congress, explain to them why housing investments are so important, and also why breaking off housing investments into a separate bill is so unacceptable and harmful to our communities. The second thing that you can be doing is, if you haven't already, sign on to our national letter in support of these housing investments. We've sent, recently we just sent a copy of the letter to congressional leaders and to our champions on the Hill, reminding them of how extensive the support is for these housing investments. If you're not on this letter, you need to be. So I encourage you to sign it and share it with your networks to make sure we have as many people on it as possible. I also want to just say briefly, or talk briefly about the appropriations process, which unfortunately is happening at the same time as Build Back Better. So we really need to have our focus on both opportunities. But House and Senate leaders are continuing to negotiate a final spending bill for fiscal year 2022. As you know, we've been operating under a continuing resolution, or a CR, since October 1st. That just keeps the government open at last year's funding amounts. That CR expires February 18th. And at that point, Congress will either have to pass another short-term CR, maybe for a month, or they're going to have to pass another bill. It seems like one of those two options are in the mix, but that they're making a lot of progress towards reaching some sort of a final agreement on a spending bill. Why is this important to all of us? Well, there is a really important opportunity to, in this final spending bill, to be able to achieve the House proposal to expand rental assistance to 125,000 more households. I know all of us have been thinking about, how do we get to a system where we have universal housing assistance? Everyone who needs it can get it. This bill is one step forward in that process to making sure that universal housing assistance is a reality. So again, I encourage you to reach out to your members of Congress, urge them to pass a spending bill, but specifically urge them to support the House proposal to expand rental assistance to 125,000 households. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Joey to see if there's any questions from folks.
Thanks so much for that excellent update, Sarah. We do have a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A box. First one is from Jerry Pohe, a procedural question. Is it one budget reconciliation per year or one per Congress?
So that's a good question, and it's actually way more complicated than you think. But typically the way that you would think about it is that you can have one budget reconciliation bill that can deal with tax issues and mandatory and spending issues once per fiscal year. So in theory, it may be possible for Democrats to do another budget reconciliation bill. For example, they used budget reconciliation to pass the American Rescue Plan Act last March, but the political likelihood of that happening is very low. So all of us should be thinking of this as, this is the train that's moving, and we want to make sure housing is on that train.
Got it. Thank you. Another question that came in from Josephine McNeil relates to inflation, which has been such a big talking point for opponents of the Build Back Better Act. Josephine's question is, has there been any consideration given to emphasizing the role of housing costs on inflation, and that reducing housing costs would help deal with the problem of inflation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that our folks in West Virginia are working every single angle that they can with Senator Manchin to support housing. And so talking about the anti-inflationary impacts of housing development or rental assistance is good and important. But I'll say what's going to be most persuasive to your members of Congress is just hearing from you that this is a priority, right? We know that there are 49 senators and 200 some House members who are on record for supporting these housing investments. What we need now is to turn our supporters into really loud, consistent champions so that they are taking that message to the White House and to their congressional leaders to push for housing. I think the inflationary piece is probably really important when it comes to Manchin. Not as important, I think, when it comes to reaching out to other members of Congress, although, any argument we can make for why we need housing is a good one.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question is from Dozier Hammond. It's a question we get sometimes, which is it worth it for advocates to write or to call Senator Schumer or Senator Durbin, the White House, in addition to their own senators?
That's a really good question. I'm glad that was brought up. So the most effective form of advocacy is for you to call your member of Congress, whether it's your representative or your senator. When you call a member of Congress, they will ask you where you live, they'll ask for your zip code. They keep track of that information to make sure that they're understanding different parts of their state or their district and what people are calling in about. But it is not effective, and sometimes it can be counterproductive for you to call a member of Congress if it's not your member of Congress. And so I'd encourage you to hold off. All of us want to be calling Senator Manchin right now, but that's not really the most effective way. Let folks in West Virginia handle that. But like I said, whether we get housing investments in this bill depends not just on Manchin, but on whether or not every other Democrat is pushing for housing investments, and if they are calling the White House and they are calling congressional leaders. So I'd say hold off from calling Schumer unless you live in New York. Hold off on calling Durbin unless you live in Illinois, or Manchin if you live in West Virginia. Focus on your members of Congress because that's where you are the most effective.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. And then Tierra from the Supportive Housing Network of New York asks, any indication on why housing was excluded from the priority list that's currently being discussed?
That is a really good question too. And I think we've talked about this in different iterations over the past year, but we know that housing is not a top priority for this White House. They are looking to other priorities in the bill. They've mentioned that for a long time. So it's not surprising to us that the White House isn't hyper-focused on housing. But I will say that just because the White House isn't keeping housing at the top of their priority list doesn't mean that we won't be successful in keeping housing dollars into this bill. The reason why I say this is because it's not just the White House who's making this agreement. They'll have to reach an agreement that all senators and all Democrats in the House can agree with. And we have very strong champions and Chairwoman Waters and Chairman Brown and others who really want to see housing in there. So rather than So the most effective way of getting at the White House, again, is to have members of Congress call the White House to let them know that they support housing. But it's not surprising, I guess, to see that the White House isn't prioritizing housing the way we would.
So I think in that answer, you answered our next question as well, Sarah, which is from Joanne Karchmer asking, aside from Congress, what's the intel on how the White House feels about keeping housing affordability in the bill? And you're saying it's not a burning priority for the White House.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's a burning priority for us, which means that if we want it in the bill, we need to be acting like this is what it is, which is a make or break moment for whether or not Congress is going to pass really historic levels of housing investments. And it falls on advocates, unfortunately, to really carry the water and our congressional champions to make sure that housing stays in the bill.
Maureen Paul asks a question we've been getting a lot the last couple of weeks, which is, what's the point of continuing to call representatives if they're already supporting this bill?
Yeah, so we're at a turning point. So they did support the bill that included 150 billion for affordable housing investments, but now we're seeing the bill completely renegotiated, right, in order to get Senator Manchin and everyone else on board. So that means that there's going to be whole new decisions about what the path forward is. And if we're not reaching out to our representatives and our senators, it leaves the impression that housing isn't a big priority for us. And if it's not a big priority for us, it's easier for them to cut it if they're already trying to scale back the Build Back Better Act to fit into a smaller, to focus on smaller, fewer priorities, right? Anything that they come to an agreement with Senator Manchin or with other Senate Democrats, it's going to have to go back for a vote in the House as well. And in that case, Democrats can only lose about 3 votes before it fails in the House either. So both Democrats in the House and Senate are extremely important. And even though they already passed the bill in the House, the bill is going to come back to them. They're going to have to vote on it again.
Got it. Thanks so much, Sarah. Deborah Franklin is asking, is it better for advocates to reach out as organizations or as individual citizens?
That's a great question. And I would love to hear, Joey, your opinion on this too. I mean, my sense is that they play different roles in advocacy. Organizations carry a lot of expertise and recognition and that sort of weight to it. But individuals are voters, and those are the ones who are going to be turning up to vote these folks in at the midterm election or not. And so I think it's important to have both weighing in with their members of Congress to the extent that they can. But I'll ask you that, Joey.
Yeah, I mean, I think your answer is right. It kind of depends case by case. I think for the most part, if you're able to, reaching out as an organization is usually the better tack, because organizations represent not just one person's voice, but organizations represent the board, the staff, the volunteers, the people who are served by the organization, and thereby they bring additional clout to the ask that you're bringing to your members of Congress. Now, that being said, some organizations might not be very well known, or perhaps they've been associated with recent scandals or something. So I would say use your best judgment, because even if you reach out as an individual, if your organization doesn't let you speak for the organization, you can always say, I'm an individual and my experience is informed by my work doing whatever the case might be. So I think organizations often can bring additional clout. And so bringing that into your advocacy can be very helpful, yes. And I'm looking for other questions. Sorry, one moment. Giancarlo Llaverias, I might have mispronounced that, is asking, would it be productive to reach out to local electeds like city councils or county legislatures?
Yeah, I think that's a great tactic. And we've already seen folks in California and other places reach out to their state and local elected officials to encourage them to be weighing in with Congress about these housing priorities. That is very effective as a strategy, because we know that members of Congress are often looking to local elected officials for guidance about local policies. They want to hear from those local officials about what do they need in their communities. And if a local government official is saying that we need money for public housing, we need money for rental assistance and for the Housing Trust Fund, we need to solve the housing issues in our community, but we can't do it without a federal partner, that's going to be very persuasive.
I think that's true. And I think local legislators represent lots of voters, and as a result, they can bring more clout to the advocacy as well. We're running a little long on this segment of our agenda, so I'll ask just one more question, Sarah. This is from Sonia Campion, which is, with the housing crisis being so severe in every congressional district, how is it not cutting through with the other issues. And the question that she asks that I think is really insightful is, are we applauding and supporting our champions enough?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think we have been working so closely with Chairwoman Waters and Chairman Brown throughout this process, lifting them up, but also lifting up the 125 House members who signed on to our Dear Colleague letter earlier, or our 36 senators who also supported housing investments. We try at every opportunity to recognize members of Congress when they're taking the action we want them to take, applauding them for it, and encouraging them to do more. So I don't think the issue is that we haven't been applauding our champions enough. But I do think that the problem is that while everyone sees housing as being a major issue in their districts or in their states, there are lots of other priorities that are also really important in this bill. And they're getting to the point where they have to make tough decisions about what to include and what not to include. So it's not that anyone has an axe to grind on housing. It's not that anyone doesn't support housing investments. It's a question of, how do these housing investments line up with other priorities that they might have in the bill? And I do, just before I get off the line, I see that Gerald is asking a question about saying, how realistic is it really that housing would be completely eliminated from this bill? And I am telling you as clearly as I can, there is a real risk here that housing would be completely eliminated from the bill, but it depends on whether or not all of us are working as effectively as we can, as consistently as we can, to be weighing in with our members of Congress and telling them why we need these resources and why they shouldn't push it off onto that other repackaged bill that won't go anywhere. So I think it's a real possibility. I don't want to say but I don't think it's a done deal. I think they're still in the midst of these negotiations, so there's a lot of opportunity for us to change that. But right now, their conversation is that housing might be eliminated from the package.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. Please do, if you can, stick around and answer any additional questions that come in through the Q&A box or through the chat box. Would really appreciate you contributing to the conversation even as we move forward with the agenda. I would like to turn it over now to Jillian Slee from Eviction Lab to talk about a new report that I am very excited about. When NLIHC was working so intently throughout 2020 on the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 effort, a couple of journalists contacted us to talk about how much do evictions impact voter turnout. And I would say to those journalists, well, we don't have any hard data on this, but you can reasonably infer that there's a correlation and so forth. But now we don't have to say it that way, because it looks like there is, in fact, some good hard data on this. So to talk about a new report on evictions and voter turnout, I'll turn it now over to Jillian Slee. Jillian, go right ahead. Jillian, I don't think we can hear you.
I'm unmuted now. So thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm delighted to join today's call and to share a snapshot of the results from a recent study that I conducted with my colleague, Matt Desmond. So the United States is at a critical juncture. Housing has become more and more expensive to the point of being unreachable for many. And at the same time, some policymakers are making it harder to vote and participate in our democracy. We sought to understand the answers to two key questions. First, does eviction affect voter turnout? And second, how do the political effects of eviction vary across different community contexts? To carry out this study, we merged two very large data sets. We used the Eviction Lab's data on court-ordered evictions and eviction filings from 2013 to 2015, and Labels and Lists data on registered voters turnout in the 2016 presidential election. For this study, we defined neighborhoods as census tracts, and our main analyses that I'm going to present today focus on a sample of just over 7,000 communities in 19 states. So first, using linear regression techniques, we find eviction plays a powerful role in depressing community voter turnout. Fewer people turn out to vote in communities where there has been forced mobility owing to evictions. Specifically, a 1 percentage point increase in the residential eviction rate predicts a 0.46 percentage point drop in the voter turnout rate. This is true even after accounting for a variety of factors like poverty, racial makeup, the percentage of renter households, and other factors known to affect both eviction and voting. Notably, the eviction filing rate has a small and statistically imprecise effect on voting, suggesting that displacement itself is more consequential for voting rather than the threat of eviction alone. In additional analyses are finding that eviction depresses voter turnout holds in urban and rural neighborhoods and communities that are located in states with new voting requirements, in neighborhoods located in uncompetitive states, and in neighborhoods with more or less exposure to eviction, although the size of eviction's influence does vary. In fact, in some community contexts, the effect of eviction is estimated to be much larger. Notably, eviction's connection with voter turnout is small and imprecisely estimated in neighborhoods located in states with same-day or election day registration, as well as in those located in battleground states. Last, in today's snapshot, we examined a data set using eviction rates from 2015, so in the run-up to the election before 2016. And we reconfirm our findings. We observed that eviction's influence is modestly larger. A 1 percentage point increase in the eviction rate predicts a 0.56 percentage point drop in the voter turnout rate. So our study demonstrates a clear link between housing and the ballot box. Eviction has a powerful negative influence on voting in American neighborhoods. Our findings suggest more people would vote if stably housed. Additionally, while we stress the need for further research on key voting policies, our findings tentatively suggest that the same day and election day registration may mitigate eviction's influence. On the other hand, new voter restrictions and the absence of same-day registration appear to strengthen eviction's depressive influence. We accordingly show when America votes, housing insecurity matters. Policymakers and organizers should therefore invest in housing and voter policies that promote stability and inclusion. Specifically, policymakers can invest in interventions aimed at reducing evictions, such as by supporting the Civil Right to Counsel and expanding access to rental assistance. Policymakers can also work to remove barriers to the ballot box, especially those that could disproportionately harm communities enduring housing insecurity. Additionally, community organizations may target voter mobilization efforts and grassroots efforts in neighborhoods affected by eviction. If you'd like to delve in deeply, read all the numbers and gain insight into the methodology, I've shared the link to our article in the slides, and also a colleague is going to drop the link in the chat. In the broader study, for example, we also employed a causal identification strategy and instrumental variables strategy specifically, along with a generalized additive model. And if you're interested in sharing a high-level summary of the research, we have a blog post on our Eviction Lab website that my colleague will also share in the chat. And thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to your questions, and I'm happy to also receive them via email.
Okay, thank you so much, Jillian, for that excellent report, and of course, for that update that you've provided for all of us here. Let's see what is in the Q&A box. First is a question from Jerry, which is, does your research suggest ways that advocates can develop targeted outreach to combat the decrease in voter participation? Are there model outreach programs that we can kind of learn from in terms of enfranchising those victimized by evictions?
So I would love to hear from other organizations and their efforts to specifically target voter mobilization. But in the paper, we think about why eviction may have this link with voting. And we specifically spend some time considering how the material hardship of eviction. You have to move, you have to re-enroll your children in school, you have to find new employment, and so voting may become less of a priority. And so easing those burdens would be significant, and it would be something that could promote democratic participation. Also, we had, for example, somebody reach out to us who raised, based on her own personal experience of eviction, issues related to her own re-registration and finding the right precinct and knowing how to re-register appropriately. So community organizations that can share that kind of information and be aware of how renters who have been touched by eviction and their neighbors potentially might need different points of connection to help re-register. And also just on a policy level, advocating for voting policies that ease barriers when you have any type of residential mobility, whether it's related to eviction or not, to make sure that you don't lose your access to the ballot would be significant.
Thanks, Jillian. And I'll add to that answer that you just gave, which is we believe through the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign that housing organizations should make sure that they are offering voter registration to all people at move-in when they enter a new address, because of course, in most places, one of the reasons people are no longer registered is that they had to update their registration when they moved. So there is a bill in Congress introduced by Representative Chuy Garcia known as the Our Homes, Our Votes Act, which would add federally assisted housing programs to the motor voter law and require all programs that receive like the low income housing tax credit or National Housing Trust Fund or public housing and so forth, that they provide voter registration forms whenever someone is moving into a new property. Let's see what else is in the Q&A box. Thanks to Juan Pablo for posting the article and the blog post into the chat box. Really appreciate that. I'm looking in. Oh, Danielle Mowry asked the question, which I think is really interesting. Were people living in shelters studied as part of this data set, or is it just specific to evictions?
So we obtained access to voter files, state voter files, and aggregated those at the neighborhood level. So if somebody was registered and that, I can't answer that specifically, I'm not quite sure, but if they were included in the voter file, they would have appeared and they voted, they would have appeared in our data set and gone. But that's something that I would have to look at more closely.
Thank you. There's another question that's a little bit outside the scope of this narrow report, but which is, you know, because evictions have such an impact on elections, are there particular anti-eviction supports that your organization or your research have shown are more effective, such as just cause protections, increased tenant representation, or other eviction prevention policies?
So in this specific study, we didn't look at which anti-eviction supports could especially intervene in the election cycle. And I would refer to colleagues in the chat. I think I can better address that question potentially in the chat. But that's something that's also definitely worth studying, both voter interventions and housing interventions in the future in both national and local elections.
All right, thanks so much, Jillian. Really appreciate that. Please stick around and answer any questions that you can in the Q&A box or the chat box. And thank you once more for this really excellent and really groundbreaking report. Turning now from the myriad ways that evictions impact voter turnout, let's discuss the way evictions impact healthcare utilization and access to healthcare. We're very fortunate to have with us Gabriel, we're very fortunate to have with us Gabriel Schwartz, who is with the Institute for Health Policy Studies at the University of California, San Francisco. Gabriel, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to share some work that we recently published with colleagues at Harvard and NYU about eviction, healthcare utilization, and healthcare access, especially disenrollment from Medicaid coverage in New York City. So I don't have to belabor this for this audience, but we know that eviction is a common occurrence among US renters, especially low-income renters. So in any given year, about just shy of 1 in 40 renting households are formally evicted, and we know it's much higher if we include informal evictions. And though that risk may seem low to some people, we know that those risks accumulate. So for example, children who are born in large US cities in the US, about 1 in 7 is evicted by the time they reach adolescence, and that includes 1 in 4 born into deep poverty. And for the families who experience it, this creates a lot of layers of adversity. So there are financial shocks associated with possession loss, having to sort of emergency store your possessions as they're removed from your home, emergency moving costs, trying to get into new housing that's safe for you and your family, trouble getting to or being on time for your job, right? So there are a lot of problems on the financial side. You also get an eviction record, which can make it much more difficult to find quality, affordable housing for years later. Most obviously, there can be displacement, so away from your social networks or known healthcare providers or pharmacies. And if you have public healthcare benefits, you obviously have to update your address in order to get the paperwork to recertify your Medicaid coverage, which now is going to your old address. And on top of that, people deal with poor mental health, which is per se bad and also a struggle for managing all of these other problems that have come into your life. So there's a growing literature that we sort of have come to know that eviction is associated with poor physical and developmental health outcomes, including infectious disease, substance use, lower birth rate, cognitive development, et cetera. But there has been less work trying to see how those poor development and health outcomes show up in healthcare system. So this study looked at how eviction might impact healthcare utilization and healthcare access. The way we did that was to first find evicted Medicaid patients by linking New York City eviction records to Medicaid claims using their street addresses. And then we matched them to control patients who had the same demographics, were living in similar neighborhoods, and had the same healthcare utilization in the 6 months before their eviction. For the methodology wonks, we used coarsened exact matching. And we found 1,300 evicted patients who met all of these inclusion criteria and matched them to a bunch of controls. And then we compared their health outcomes over 6 months of follow-up. So whether they were more likely to be disenrolled from Medicaid, to lose their Medicaid coverage, their healthcare spending, a few different kinds of healthcare visits, and then their pharmaceutical prescription fills. So here's the first set of results. So here are the outcomes along the bottom, and then on the y-axis, these are odds ratios or spending ratios, depending. I can walk through what these mean. So first, we found that evicted Medicaid patients had 63% higher odds of losing Medicaid in the 6 months following an eviction, and 43% higher odds of losing Medicaid for so long that Medicaid won't retrospectively reimburse you for healthcare costs you accrue while you're disenrolled. At the same time, there are 28% lower odds of generating any healthcare spending, so basically of receiving no healthcare at all. But among the patients who did show up in the healthcare system, evicted patients generated 20% more spending on average, right? So fewer of them are getting any healthcare, but the ones who show up in the healthcare system are costing more. And in these models, we sort of accounted for the fact that they're also more likely to drop off of the Medicaid rolls. So on balance, across these sort of two effects, evicted patients are generating more spending for the Medicaid system on average. When we try to see what is driving those spending patterns, a few sort of early culprits. So evicted patients are filling a third fewer prescription fills than their controls, even though they were filling the same number before eviction. Fewer ambulatory care visits and more acute care visits, though we know that sort of you can see these error bars, right? The acute care visits and ambulatory care visits, they're like marginally significant. So we need more evidence on that. But there are other studies. There's a great one by researchers called Collinson and Reed, looking at how people facing eviction were randomized by the court system to more or less tenant-friendly judges, and used that sort of as a natural experiment, and found similarly in New York that evicted patients face higher hospitalization risk. So this sort of acute care visit finding we think is pretty robust. So what does that mean? So on one side, we found that evidence that eviction impairs healthcare access, right? Increased odds of losing Medicaid coverage, fewer prescription fills, et cetera. At the same time, increasing costs. So they're spending more when they show up to the hospital, and we think that that's because they are having more acute care visits. So what does that mean for policy? At least if this sort of holds up in future research. First, if we prevent eviction, that likely means that we're ensuring Medicaid patients have better access to care while also generating offsetting savings in the Medicaid budget, and preventing acute health crises. So this is a win-win-win. If you're a Medicaid provider or a healthcare provider, if you're helping evicted patients maintain their benefits and better access care, that's warranted and may even be cost effective. And I'd be remiss at this moment not to talk about COVID. So eviction prevention, based on these findings, might be particularly important during this Omicron surge, right? We know access to healthcare is critical for keeping people alive. Eviction prevention policies and rent relief are expiring or dwindling, and the hospital system is already overwhelmed. In related work, with my colleague Kate Leifheit and some friends, we also looked at eviction moratoriums. We're not the only people to have done this during COVID, and found that eviction moratoriums are protective against COVID transmission and death, right? Because people are doubling up or begin experiencing homelessness, and both of those are real risk factors for COVID transmission. And then they go out into their communities, even if they may not know they're sick, and can spread that to other people. And if evicted patients are being forced into the hospital because of health crises caused by eviction, right, the hospital system is already full and about to burst. So I really want to underscore that our findings shouldn't be taken as just evicted people need help accessing the healthcare system and may face acute health problems, that this is actually a community health problem, a population health problem that affects all of us. Thank you for letting me share these with you. And if I don't catch anything in this Q&A, please feel free to reach out after the talk.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for that excellent information and for those wonderful slides. We look forward to sharing those in the follow-up email tomorrow. I do have one question that's come into the Q&A box so far from Chelsea Heyman, which is, many people with disabilities rely on Medicaid for their health care. In your study, did you also look at disability status as a potential factor?
We didn't, but it's a great point. In this particular study, because of we tried to be really specific about which people we were including in the study, in terms of like, you had to be on Medicaid for 6 months, you had to be living in private housing, not public housing, because New York City doesn't report public housing. So the number of people we're able to follow is pretty small. And so the sample of people who also have disabilities was just even smaller. So it's harder to look at, but it's a great point. And in future work, we'll look at how feasible that is with these data sources.
And Gabriel, was there a form of judicial watch that was in use, or how did you identify which judges might be more tenant friendly?
Oh, sorry. So that is this other paper by Collinson and Reed are their names. So they did more of a natural experiment. So what we were doing was taking evictions that were carried out by marshals in New York City. They like self-report the evictions that they are carrying out on behalf of the court. But they share a lot of information about people, and it's very public about like specifically what address at what time, which, you know, that's probably a problem in terms of people's rights to be able to access housing in the future and not have their eviction records out in the world. But for us, it's really helpful for matching to Medicaid records based on where people were living at the time.
Oh, great. Okay, great. Thanks for, I have one more question just popped in. Do you have what was your overall sample for this study?
Yeah, so we had about 1,300 evicted patients and matched them to like several 100,000 people who had like very similar demographics and healthcare history, because it's like all of the people in New York City who are on Medicaid available to us. Yeah, so we have, I think, a decent enough sample to look overall at these associations.
And when you say you match them to overall tenants with similar demographics, which demographics are you referring to? I assume gender, race, income level?
Yeah, gender, race, age, like what borough they were living in. But for income level, like these are all people who are eligible for Medicaid. So all of these people are like relatively low income, but Medicaid doesn't keep track on the claims end of like exactly how much money they're making.
Judith Samuels has an interesting question in the Q&A box. She's asking, in the demographic breakdown, looking at age, were you able to identify the impact specifically as it relates to infants or very young children? She's indicating that in Massachusetts, a lot of what they're seeing is that infants are the most likely to live in shelters or do not have stable housing. And you're wondering about, and she's wondering about the relationship between eviction and healthcare for people who are experiencing homelessness in that age group.
It's a great question. So we didn't do it in this study, but in past studies we have. So there's sort of two ways to ask this question. People whose mothers are evicted during their gestation, so it's, and actually not just us, Jillian's center at the eviction lab also looked at this, are more likely to give birth to infants who are low birth weight, who are preterm, and then if you are born preterm or low birth rate, you're also more likely, your family's more likely to get evicted in the next 5 years, which is, right, it's cyclical between poor health and unstable housing. And if you follow those kids, you find that, at age 5, they have double the prevalence of food insecurity. They are more likely to have cognitive impairment, right? So this is sort of a powerful impact on children, but we have less evidence on specific healthcare outcomes after birth.
All right, thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Gabriel. Please continue to look at the Q&A box and the chat box as we move along in our agenda and offer any answers or additional links or additional insights that you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I would like to move on now to talk about a third new report. This one perhaps a little bit less directly about evictions, but more so about emergency rental assistance and tenant protections related to emergency rental assistance and the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'm really pleased to turn it over to Jade Vasquez from the ERASE Ending Rent Arrears to Stop Evictions project here at NLIHC. And Jade, please take it away.
Thanks, Joey. Hi, everyone. So last week, NLIHC released a new report titled Tenant Protections and Emergency Rental Assistance During and Beyond the COVID-19 Pandemic. The report provides a descriptive analysis of laws and policies related to tenant protections and emergency rental assistance that have been enacted or implemented by state and local governments in 2021. The public health emergency and resulting historic aid to renters have fundamentally shifted the housing landscape in the United States. In addition to the federal moratorium and availability of emergency rental assistance, state and local jurisdictions across the country have recognized the crucial role tenant protections play in preventing evictions and ensuring housing stability for the most marginalized households. 30 states and 59 localities passed or implemented more than 130 new laws or policies to protect tenants from eviction in 2021. 6 executive orders and 16 court orders were signed, 78 state and local laws were passed, and 33 ERA programs enacted policies that provided additional protections to tenants. Next slide, please. So the types of tenant protections in the report include state and local eviction moratoriums, pauses on the eviction process to allow for ERA processing, mandates to increase information about ERA and limit tenant fees, increases to tenant representation during the eviction process, such as right to counsel and increasing government funding for legal aid. And lastly, protections that reduce discrimination and promote housing stability, such as source of income discrimination laws and sealed or expunged eviction records legislation. Next slide, please. And so while the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need for additional tenant protections, it has also presented opportunities to learn how existing tenant protections can be strengthened and expanded in the future. The following are some of NLIHC's recommendations to strengthen tenant protections nationwide. The first being state and local governments should continue to pass tenant protections in all stages of the eviction process to advance housing as a human right. The second is states and localities must assess their current tenant protection laws and programs to ensure maximum effectiveness in preventing evictions. This includes states and localities investing in the enforcement of source of income discrimination laws, adequately funding right to counsel programs so all struggling renters have full access to legal representation, and ensuring that all records of the eviction process from the notice to the judgment are sealed. The third, ERA programs, states and local courts should develop collaborative partnerships to ensure the successful implementation and enforcement of tenant protections at all stages of the ERA and eviction process. State and local courts should centralize eviction filing and outcome data for facilitating access to ERA to those in need, enforce existing tenant protections, and track housing stability outcomes for tenants who may have been evicted. Long-term federal protections such as source of income discrimination laws, a good cause eviction standards, right to counsel and sealed eviction legislation are also needed to ensure that all renters across all jurisdictions in this country share a basic level of protection. And lastly, Congress must authorize and fund a permanent program to provide emergency rental assistance, such as that proposed in the Eviction Crisis Act to ensure housing stability for households that experience financial shocks after the pandemic ends. Next slide, please. So the Tenant Protections Report derived from NLIT's State and Local Tenant Protections Database, which is a resource of ERA-related tenant protections that were passed in 2021. Similar to the report, the database includes policies, legislation, ordinances, executive orders, and court orders that cities, counties, and states across the country have enacted to protect marginalized renters and prevent a wave of evictions that would have been catastrophic during the global pandemic. Each tenant protection includes the state, jurisdiction, bill of ordinance number, a short description of the law or policy, and a link to the legal text. Researchers, policymakers, and housing advocates can look to this resource to inform local advocacy efforts and encourage elected officials in their respective jurisdictions to pass similar tenant protections. NLIT will regularly update the state and local ERA tenant protections database as we learn about the passage of new laws and policies in 2022. So if you know of any recent legislation passed in your city, county, or state, please feel free to share with the HoUSed team by contacting me at jvasquez@nlitc.org. Next slide, please. To accompany the report, NLIT's research team has also developed 2 interactive maps that demonstrate which states and localities enacted or implemented tenant protections in 2021. Next slide. And so in addition to listing the type of tenant protections in each state, the state tenant protections map also includes the number of renter households in each state, the number and the percentage of renters behind on rent in each state, and then the percentage of low income or cost burdened households served by the ERA program in each state. Next slide, please. And so one of the goals of this report and the Tenant Protections Project as a whole is to demonstrate how states and localities are using their power to advance housing as a human right. Emergency rental assistance and the short-term protections tied to it will eventually expire, but long-term tenant protections like source of income discrimination laws, like right to counsel, sealed eviction legislation, and good cause eviction legislation will outlast the pandemic. We hope that the Tenant Protections Report, the maps, and the database can serve as a guide to housing advocates and policymakers looking to pass similar protections in their own jurisdiction, as well as inform struggling tenants living in these jurisdictions of their rights. We believe that this whole of government approach is crucial to meaningfully addressing our nation's housing affordability crisis, prevent evictions, and end homelessness once and for all. Thank you, and I'll accept questions now.
Thank you so much, Jade, for sharing that excellent information and for creating this wonderful resource. We have a couple of questions that have come in. One from Josephine McNeil asking, what is the overall time period that's covered in this report?
So we really focus on 2021. That's when ERA, Emergency Rental Assistance, really began its implementation, or program began distributing the funds. And so a big portion of the report, it does focus on long-term tenant protections like a source of income, right to counsel, but a lot of the report does focus on tenant protections that are tied to emergency rental assistance. So I would say 2021, the era of ERA, basically.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jade. I will also ask a more general question related to emergency rental assistance. The question is, why are we focused so much on people about to be evicted? What about people who do not have homes and need money for moving costs and security deposits and so forth?
Yeah, I think, a portion of the report does focus on housing stability. And when we talk about sealed eviction legislation, expungement of eviction records. But I will say that the Treasury guidance allows for ERA to be used to help families who have lost or are at risk of losing their housing by paying for relocation assistance, prospective rent, security deposits, and temporary hotel accommodations. ERA grantees can also use up to 10% of program funds for housing stability services. And then they also, the Treasury has also published some promising practices. I see Elena dropping some resources in the chat, but they've also published some promising practices for using commitment letters to assist prospective renters. And they highlight the opportunity to help those with the current lease to prove to a prospective landlord that they can pay the security deposit and access future rent assistance. But I would also say that if you're looking for specific, if you've been evicted and you have like an eviction on your record, you can search if your state has one. I wrote a list of 8 states that have like a sealed eviction legislation. So those states that have that kind of law in place is California, Colorado, Illinois, Minnesota, Nevada, New Jersey, New York, and Oregon. So if you live in one of those states, definitely take advantage of that type of sealed eviction legislation.
Thank you so much, Jade. We're going to move now to the field updates portion of our agenda, but please do take a look at the Q&A box and the chat box for any questions that you might yet be able to answer. Thank you so much for that presentation. So we'll turn now to our next presenter, which is Tara Barauskas in Santa Monica, California. In Santa Monica, there is a new and innovative solution to address the housing needs of people who have been displaced by freeway projects. Tara, why don't you take it away and let us know what's happening in your backyard?
Great. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just trying to make sure I can move my slides around here. Oops. Sorry, I'm trying to get used to this. I'm doing oh, there we go. Okay, great. So a little bit about us. We're a nonprofit based in Santa Monica, California. We were established 40 years ago by community leaders, and we specifically focus on building and operating affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods. We're currently serving over 4,000 people, and you can find more information about us at communitycorp.org. Oops. Sorry. So here's just a few photos of some of the buildings that we've built in Santa Monica. We have over 100 buildings in every part of Santa Monica, which is one of the most high income parts of LA County. So we're very proud of our accomplishments so far. And we really focus on resident well-being as part of what we do at Community Corp. And so we try to make sure that not only do we have a high standard in terms of our units and our amenities and our building appearances, but that we also offer a lot of different well-being amenities such as natural air and light and hardwood floors. And most important, I think, is the location, being in neighborhoods where kids can go to school. So you see in that photo, there's a school across the street from this building, near parks and near transit. So I'm here today to talk about a new policy that the city of Santa Monica just created. And I did not write the policy, and nor do we work, I don't work for the city, we're a separate nonprofit, but we are the largest affordable housing provider in Santa Monica, and obviously very keenly familiar with the policy and many different facets of Santa Monica. So to give you a little bit of history, Santa Monica was a very diverse and very, I guess I would just say, friendly community for people from all different cultural backgrounds until about the 1920s. And unfortunately, the KKK came in and they were trying to push all the Black-owned businesses out. And it was such an unfortunate thing that actually the city created a Caucasian clause that would prevent residents from owning businesses or housing by the beach. And the beach itself was also restricted. There was just one part where Black community members could go that was called the Inkwell. And that's a photo there. In addition, as in many other parts of the country, there was redlining that occurred to prevent Black community members from buying properties in the more, I guess, favorable parts of the city. And there were also restrictive covenants that were recorded against many of the properties, particularly single family homes, to prevent people of color. So not just Black community members, but also, people who were Jewish, or I mean, there was a whole list of different people who were excluded from occupying these homes. So, a really terrible part of our history that, I think we're all learning a little bit more about now. And I think The Color of Law was a really great book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. This stuff really did happen. And so I think, many of us advocates are trying to figure out what can we do to repair some of those wrongs. So, in Santa Monica in particular, there were a few different communities that were largely occupied by people of color, in particular Black and Latinx community members. And those were unfortunately the neighborhoods that were targeted for displacement. They were called urban renewal projects, which of course, as we know, that's not really what it was. There was construction of the 10 freeway, and there's still, I think, a lot being uncovered about how it was decided which parts of LA County would have to have the freeway running through it. But I did hear that, Beverly Hills, which is, obviously a very exclusive neighborhood, basically refused to allow the 10 freeway to run through it. So, I think there are probably a lot of those kinds of things that happened, but we don't know all of them. But we do know that Santa Monica was basically bisected by the 10 freeway. So it tore apart the Pico neighborhood, which was really the diverse part, like I said, for generations of people of color. So that happened. And then also the city decided to redevelop the Civic Center area, which was called the Belmar, in the 1950s. And you can see here a photo of what the housing used to look like back then, which they were small single family homes. They were called shotgun houses. That was the style. And they were all taken by eminent domain. So people who owned property literally had it taken away from them. So, a lot of this has just recently come to light. And so the city of Santa Monica has tried to create a policy to start to address some of these things that have happened. And this one is called the right to return. Basically, anybody who was displaced during those two urban renewal projects that I just mentioned could now come and apply to be at the top of the affordable housing list in Santa Monica. The way the program is currently structured, it's now open. It's open for a month. And anybody who can provide documentation that their family was displaced would, like I said, go to the top of the list. And just to give you an illustration, right now, the affordable housing wait list in Santa Monica is about 8,000 people, maybe more. So obviously getting to the top of the list is a huge deal. It is limited to 100 people at this point. And the only people who are in front of them would be anyone who's being evicted through an Ellis Act or no fault eviction. And we usually probably get 5 of those a year, not too many. Santa Monica really has a lot of really strong protections against displacement for renters, which is really good. So I wanted to share with you my perspective as a longtime practitioner in Santa Monica of the pros and cons of this policy, because I'm really hopeful that if you hear of other policies like this being created, you'll be better equipped to help advocate to better support people of color. So the pros, obviously, as I mentioned, is, it does take years to get into affordable housing in Santa Monica. So the ability to jump to the top of the list is really a huge advantage. And it could help people who had to move away to come back and live in the community that either they were raised in or maybe their grandparents grew up in. So that's obviously a wonderful thing. And I think it was the city's way to try to start to address what happened. As an advocate, though, of course, I have to be slightly critical because I just don't think this policy goes far enough. And the first one is actually something I heard directly from the granddaughter of someone whose housing was taken away by eminent domain. And she spoke at a Committee for Racial Justice meeting and said, why does the city think that the only thing that we want is affordable housing? Her family in particular owned homes. They owned homes and they owned duplexes, and all of it was taken away from them. So she felt like it was wildly inadequate, is maybe the best way to say, to just offer people affordable housing. And first of all, you would have to qualify. We don't even know if people still are low income or not. So she just felt like it was a really small gesture. I think also the fact that it is limited only to 1 month and 100 people really just doesn't go far enough. And then something I heard from Black community members is back in those days in particular, there were many people who were raised by maybe aunts and uncles, or there were different ways of caregiving families than just a parent or a grandparent. And there isn't a provision for those caretakers to get advantage in this system. And my biggest problem, which is actually something a lot of us advocates have been working on, is that we really feel that the city of Santa Monica should have stepped back and started in a more comprehensive manner. So with a comprehensive approach of starting with a formal acknowledgement of some of these things that have happened, a meaningful apology, a statement about these historical happenings, and then a menu of options is, I guess, the way I would put it, where we would want to see, okay, like anybody who was affected could either get priority on the affordable housing list, they could get down payment assistance to try to bring back some affordable home ownership for people, or maybe help with a small business that they want to create. But just to limit it to this one thing, I think to many advocates just kind of deepens the wound, if anything. And so I guess, I do appreciate that the city wanted to try to do something, and that's good. But like I said, if you see things like this happening in your own cities, I definitely recommend you advocating more for a more comprehensive approach. So that's my presentation, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Tara, for that wonderful presentation about what's happening in Santa Monica. If you take a look at the chat box, you'll notice that there are lots of folks expressing appreciation. I'm not noticing any questions at this point, but please keep your eyes on the chat box and the Q&A box to answer any questions that might trickle in. Thank you so much. And I think we will turn now to the opposite coast, leaving California and heading all the way to Rhode Island, where we have Katie West from Housing Network of Rhode Island, the manager for the HoUSed Coalition, who will chat with us a little bit about what's been happening with a budget surplus and how some of that money might be going to housing affordability programs. Katie, please take.
Hi, everyone. Joey, thank you for the introduction. It's good to be here. Thanks to NLIHC for inviting me to come on, and the presenters before, just the research in your advocacy. And thank you for that informative presentation, Tara. I'm thinking about what our capital city of Providence is confronting some of those issues as well. And so just thinking about that. But I will move on to talking about what's happening in Rhode Island related to our state budget. So as Joey mentioned, I am from the Housing Network of Rhode Island. We're a 17-member nonprofit or trade organization of nonprofit housing developers here in the smallest state. And we support membership, coordinate policy and advocacy in the HoUSed effort, which is a multi-sector coalition to increase the supply of safe, healthy, and affordable homes. We also do some work on processing our state's ERA applications. So Rhode Island received $1.1 billion in state fiscal recovery funds from the American Rescue Plan. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Over the spring and summer, we, as HoUSed, engaged in a robust stakeholder engagement process to outline priorities and really hear from our multi-sector coalition about what types of initiatives we wanted to advance through our request focused on affordable housing. We've been advocating for a $500 million investment since September. And so I'll drop the link in the chat on what our recommendations are, but just a quick summary. We requested $350 million to produce, protect, and preserve affordable homes across the state, $60 million to increase housing access and stability, and $90 million to support cities and towns to increase the creation and preservation of safe and healthy homes, with a particular focus on resources to address housing quality standards and code violations, which we know can be a driver of evictions and housing instability, and increase capacity at state and municipal agencies. So for the past couple of years, which is great. Well, our General Assembly has been signaling housing to be a priority. Last year, the General Assembly passed our state's first dedicated funding stream ever for affordable production, which is estimated to generate around $4 million a year, which is less than what we asked for, but they did capitalize it with $25 million in funding initially. Also, voters passed a $65 million housing bond, and in December, the first round of funding from that was approved, which was $31 million to create and preserve an estimated 600 units. And throughout all of this advocacy, our focus as Homes RI has been on ensuring that we are talking about serving low-income Rhode Islanders and emphasizing the scale of need, as well as the fact that we need comprehensive land use and zoning reform to really make headway on increasing the number of affordable homes in Rhode Island. So we're one of the last states to allocate ARPA dollars, as folks may be aware. In the fall, our Governor Dan McKee put forward what he called a down payment plan that was approximately 10% of the $1 billion state fiscal recovery fund allocation as a supplemental budget for fiscal year 22, so the prior year's budget. That included $29 million for housing initiatives. And I won't go through a breakdown, but it included funds for development in conjunction with our bonds, site acquisition, dollars for housing stability services and supports, and $500,000 of that for our Office of Housing and Community Development to increase staffing and capacity in that agency. The first day of our legislative session, which started on January 4th, the General Assembly passed the supplemental budget. So that $29 million was enacted. Last Thursday, our governor introduced his fiscal year 2023 budget, which included $250 million in American Rescue Plan funds for housing. And to summarize just some figures, I know I'm talking fast and throwing a lot of dollars out, but it's $145 million for development, including pre-development costs, site acquisition, creation and preservation. They're estimating creation of approximately 1,500 units for low and moderate income households, which would be up to 80% of area median income, and $20 million for approximately 250 households up to 120% of area median income, $50 million for down payment assistance, some funds for community revitalization, $26.5 million for housing stability and homelessness supports and increasing our shelter capacity, and then some funding for the Office of Housing and Community Development, some additional funding to increase capacity there, and to implement a statewide comprehensive housing plan. We also recently, the state recently appointed a new Deputy Secretary of Commerce to oversee all housing initiatives statewide. So that person just started in this month in January. And so, we're looking forward to working with that office and seeing what comes out of the plan. As far as our response to the budget announcement, we put out a statement saying it's a good start, but we would like to see this fully funded at $500 million, just because the scale of the need is so great, and our lack of investment in housing infrastructure in the state it's just a very deep hole. And as I mentioned earlier, we're also advocating for some land use and zoning reforms. There are currently in Rhode Island, there's 2 state legislative commissions that are convening to both study land use, looking at land use policy statewide, and a commission that's studying a state law that requires each city and town to have 10% of its year-round affordable housing stock be affordable. Currently, only 6 cities and towns in Rhode Island meet that law, and it's been on the books since the early 90s. So they're looking at how to make that law more effective. Additionally, we're working on some initiatives related to eviction and housing stability, including sealing of eviction files, rental suitability legislation, which would require landlords to furnish a certificate of rental suitability to prospective tenants, and have regular inspections that to demonstrate that their housing meets quality standards, as well as work that we're engaged in on our emergency rental assistance program related to our race effort. And just, I'll quickly say this one last thing because we talked about voting. The Housing Network is a member of the Let Rhode Island Vote Coalition, and that coalition is working to pass legislation that would improve access to and modernize elections in Rhode Island. In Rhode Island in 2020, 500,000 Rhode Islanders voted, and 60% of them, more than 60% of them, used either vote by mail or in-person early voting, which prior to the pandemic were not available options in Rhode Island. So the Let RI Vote Act would make those changes permanent, expand access to early voting and mail ballots. There's also a complementary bill that would ask voters to approve a constitutional amendment allowing our General Assembly to create same-day voter registration. So I will stop there, but that's just an update on the, our collective legislative agenda, what's happening with our budget. Happy to answer questions. Thanks.
One question I have for you, Katie, is in the 500 million that you all have proposed, made it available for housing solutions, to what extent is it affordable housing programs? To what extent is it targeted? And I see you just dropped that in the chat.
More
box.
specific, yeah, like.
So affordable to whom? Extremely low income people, middle income people?
Prioritizing low income households below 80% of AMI. And there's some, like in our recommendations, there's some breakdowns that are more specific to target extremely low income households, including permanent supportive housing and rental assistance, like supportive housing and operating subsidies for housing developments to serve people at those lower income levels.
Okay, thank you so much, Katie. You've got one question in the Q&A box from someone in Rhode Island asking how they can get involved, which is always a great question to answer. So take a look at that, please.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'll put my email in the chat. That's the best way to get involved. So email me directly, but you can also visit our website, which is homesri.org, and there's like a form you can fill out. But I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, thanks so much, Katie. So we've heard now from the West Coast and the East Coast. Let's see what's going on up near the Canadian border. We have with us Sue Schierick from Northlands Rescue Mission in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And Sue is also the current board president for the North Dakota Coalition for Homeless People. And Sue is going to share a little bit about some recent work with policymakers on emergency rental assistance up in North Dakota. Sue, can you unmute and take it away?
Good afternoon, everybody. So just a little bit of history on who we are and a little bit of my role on NDCHP. Where I'm currently located, if you go 4 blocks behind me, you're in Minnesota. And if you go 90 miles to the right of me, you're in Canada. North Dakota is a unique state in that on the western part of the state, there is oil fields and ranching. And on the eastern part of the state, it's more agriculture. There's a little bit of some aviation work that's going on, and it's more dense, if there's such a word in this state, university systems here. And the western part of the state has been significantly impacted by the bust and boom of the oil work, and which has impacted our state in terms of housing in a lot of ways. Our homeless coalition is a statewide coalition and made up from members from all across the state. And we do not have a paid staff. The board chair and the board of directors do the bulk of the work. And so when we started working on this process, the agency that I draw a paycheck from, the homeless shelter, we weren't directly involved in it. And I really had to do a deep dig to find out what was going on because I really wasn't aware of the nature of the problem. And in bringing together a group of people from across the state community action agencies, our board members and other providers with fair housing and other entities. Once we started talking, we realized the issue was pretty significant. And so part of the problem is that the funds didn't get deployed in our state till very late in the game. The legislature met and they didn't make a decision on deploying the funds till the end of session, which was in April. And so we had a very late start in the process. And then the money didn't get sent out in the way that other funds have. So the money went through the Department of Human Services, and they aren't usually the entity that works with funding in our state. And things really kind of got bunched up at the state level. So as we were meeting, the state cap agency decided that for their purposes, because there were a lot of struggles with the process, applications were taking a long time to process. The actual mechanics of the process were difficult, and it was a very laborious process for them. And so they put together a letter that they sent to the state program coordinator on December 9th, and it outlined specific issues that they were having with the logistics of submitting an application and getting information back. It was a very well-written, specific letter. That was sent on December 9th, and to date, no response has been received. On December 28th, the Homeless Coalition sent a letter to the head of Human Services in the state and said, we are in support of the letter from the CAP agencies, and we would like to get together with you and talk about how we can make this better. And we had tried by phone call and email and had no responses. So 25 of our member organizations signed on to this letter, and it was sent out, and no response as well. So after everyone got back from Christmas break, we kind of gave a few days grace period, and we re-met to determine what our next steps were. And then things just started happening like dominoes falling. There was an article in the media discussing the program and the fact that our state was going to have to refund dollars. A letter was sent to a group of senators by an application counselor, and an advocacy group was meeting in Fargo to talk about asking for a FOIA, having a press conference about why this money was being returned to the federal government, and really starting to press forward with a loud voice. I put in a call to a state senator here, and you know how they talk about 6 degrees of separation? Well, in North Dakota, it's about 1.5. And I had worked with this senator before in our different day jobs, and she put together a listening session that was just on Friday, and it was with senators from both parties, and it went for over 2 hours. And it truly was a listening session. So in our listening session, we talked about the history of where this money came from, how it ended up in our state. And we included the fact that they played a part in not getting the money out as well because of the delay in their passing the legislation. We talked about what was happening from a client's perspective. We talked about how we got involved in the process, issues that users were having. We had a landlord on the call who manages 140 some different properties. And she talked about for every apartment within each of those properties, how she had to file a different application for each of them and the frustrations that she was experiencing. We had a provider talk about a program one of the reservations in our state is using, where they're using their dollars and they have had 1,000 applications put into the system, and 98% of them were approved, and the turnaround time is generally about 3 days. So there are ways that the programs can work and do work. But by the same token, she also found out 15 minutes before the call that the people who were receiving these funds are also losing SNAP benefits and other benefits, because then the money they receive for the rental assistance has been dedicated as income, and they're losing SNAP benefits. After all of that, we came to the legislators with a specific ask. We knew that we had to craft that and not just say, well, now what are you going to do? How are you going to help us? So we asked for communication from all levels of DHS staff, coordination with established providers, as well as other state departments, because we have a coordinated entry system and we have a continuum of care, and those systems were not used at all to get the funds out or as even part of the process in the current system. We asked for complete data, including the number of households that have applied, because we have not received any feedback. We know that North Dakota has served its 4,000th household, but we don't know how many have actually applied. 4,000 out of how many? And finally, we asked from the legislators, our goal is to improve the program. So from the legislative perspective, with legislative intent, to change the eviction process in North Dakota to include diversion programming and access to legal representation as a part of the eviction process. And after that call, our legislators got together and they are filing letters to both the head of DHS and to the governor. The faith communities from across the state have a letter to the editor in different media outlets today across the state. And we just had a meeting this morning from our advocacy group, and we are going to be working on having the news outlet who wrote the original article do a series that presents the issues from the perspective of a client and from others, so to make it a series. We are going to continue to fact check, and the advocacy component of that group is going to continue to put pressure on the governor's office. So we feel like we have just in the last week and a half to 2 weeks made great strides in terms of actually trying to put pressure on DHS to make this a workable program, because ultimately it's the people that we serve that are being impacted. We've had 40 below wind chill days here and blizzards, and having a roof over your head and a place to stay is really crucial and critical. If you may have seen in the media this last week, there was a family, I can't remember what country they were from, but they were involved in some human trafficking, and they were walking across the Canadian border, and they froze to death out in the middle of some snowdrifts in a field, and one of them was a little baby. So having a roof over your head here is critical and crucial, and these are small steps, but for us from where we've been, these are huge steps.
Thank you, Sue, for discussing the various challenges that are happening in North Dakota and some of the ways that advocates like yourself are responding to them. Unfortunately, we've got 4:01 right now, so I won't have time for any questions on North Dakota, but we will share those with you, Sue, as they come in. With that, I'd like to remind everyone to please reach out to your members of Congress and encourage them to be not just supporters, but public champions for housing affordability on the reconciliation bill, and specifically fight for the housing provisions and solutions in the Build Back Better Act to be included in the final bill. Thank you all for joining us today. Look for the recording and the follow-up notes in your inboxes tomorrow. Bye, everyone.